First story, The Night the Desert Glowed, Australian Outback, 1999. It was supposed to be just another routine drive through the Australian outback. I'd made this trip countless times before, hauling supplies between remote towns. The vastness of the desert always struck me, but that night in 1999, it felt different. The darkness seemed thicker, more oppressive. I remember checking my rearview mirror, seeing nothing but inky blackness behind me. The radio had long since faded to static, so I drove in silence, the hum of my engine the only company. I wasn't prepared for what was about to happen. Nobody could be. It started with a light, so bright it made me squint. At first, I thought it was another vehicle, maybe a truck with its high beams on. But something felt off. The light was too intense, too white. It didn't flicker or bulb like normal headlights would on the uneven road. I remember my heart starting to race, my palms getting sweaty on the steering wheel. I tried to rationalize it, tell myself it was just another driver, but deep down I knew this was something else entirely. The light grew larger in my mirror, closing the distance between us at an impossible speed. That's when it started to rise. I watched, mouth agape, as the light ascended into the night sky. It wasn't a vehicle at all. This thing, whatever it was flying. It hovered above my car, bathing everything in an eerie blue-white glow. The desert around me lit up like it was midday. I could see every grain of sand, every scrub bush for miles. My mind was reeling, trying to make sense of what my eyes were seeing. That's when the engine died. 1 second it was running smooth as ever. The next, nothing. Complete silence. I coasted to a stop, my hands shaking as I tried to restart the car. The key turned, but there wasn't even a click. It was like every bit of electricity had been sucked out of the vehicle. Then came the buzzing. It started low, almost imperceptible, but quickly grew in intensity. It wasn't coming from outside, it was inside my head. A high-pitched whine that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. I pressed my palms against my ears, but it did nothing to block out the sound. It felt like my skull was vibrating, my thoughts scrambling. I remember trying to open the door, to run, but my limbs wouldn't respond. The last thing I saw before everything went black was that light, so bright it seemed to be burning itself into my retinas. I don't know how long I was out. When I came to, the first thing I noticed was the cold. The desert night had settled in, and I was shivering. But that wasn't what scared me. It was where I was. I found myself standing in the middle of the road, miles from where I'd stopped. My car was nowhere in sight. I spun around, disoriented, trying to get my bearings. The stars above were the only familiar thing, but even they seemed wrong somehow, like the constellations had shifted. My clothes were damp with dew, as if I'd been lying in the grass, not standing on asphalt. That's when I noticed the dust. My skin was covered in a fine, silvery powder. It sparkled in the starlight, almost beautiful if it wasn't so terrifying. I tried to brush it off, but it clung to me like it was magnetized. It had no smell, no texture I could discern. It was just there. Impossible and inexplicable. I patted my pockets, surprised to find my car keys still there. But how? I'd left them in the ignition when the engine died. None of it made sense. I started walking, my legs wobbly and unsure, like I was using them for the first time. Every step sent a jolt of pain through my body. It felt like I'd run a marathon, but I had no memory of moving at all. As I stumbled along the road, My mind raced, trying to piece together what had happened. The night was silent now. No buzzing, no unearthly light. Just the sound of my ragged breathing and the crunch of gravel under my feet. I kept expecting to see my car around every bend, but there was nothing. Just endless stretches of empty highway. I don't know how long I walked. Time seemed to have lost all meaning. The stars wheeled overhead, and I felt like I was moving through a dream. My throat was parched, my lips cracked from dehydration. I hadn't thought to bring water with me on what should have been a short drive. Now I was paying the price. The silver dust on my skin had started to itch, a constant reminder that something inexplicable had happened to me. I tried to recall anything after the light appeared, but my memories were a jumbled mess. Flashes of metal corridors, strange symbols, and faces that weren't quite human. But were they real memories or just my brain trying to fill in the blanks? It was nearly dawn when I finally saw my car. It sat on the side of the road exactly where I'd left it when the engine died. But that was impossible. I'd been walking for hours in the opposite direction. How could it be here? I approached cautiously, half expecting it to disappear like a mirage. But it was real. Solid. I ran my hand along the hood, feeling the cool metal under my palm. The silver dust on my skin left faint trails on the paintwork. With shaking hands, I tried the door. It was locked. I fumbled for my keys, inserted them into the lock. The door opened with a familiar creak. Everything inside was exactly as I'd left it. The steering wheel was still angled where I'd swerved when the light first appeared. My water bottle sat in the cup holder, condensation beading on its surface. I collapsed into the driver's seat, overwhelmed by a wave of relief and confusion. I turned the key in the ignition, holding my breath. The engine roared to life as if nothing had ever been wrong with it. I sat there for a long time, engine idling, trying to make sense of what had happened. The sun was rising now, painting the desert in shades of pink and gold. It all looked so normal, so ordinary. But I knew that nothing would ever be normal again. I caught sight of myself in the rearview mirror and barely recognized the person staring back. My eyes were bloodshot, my face gaunt. And there was that, silver dust, clinging to every inch of exposed skin. I tried to wipe it off again, but it seemed to have bonded with my skin, becoming a part of me. I finally put the car in gear and started driving. I didn't know where I was going, just that I needed to get away from that stretch of road. As I drove, I wrestled with whether to tell anyone what had happened. Who would believe me? I had no proof, no evidence beyond the dust on my skin and the gaps in my memory. And deep down I was afraid. Afraid that if I spoke about it, they might come back for me. So I kept quiet. I drove home, showered, watched as the silver dust swirled down the drain. But it never fully washed away. To this day, in certain lights, I can still see it shimmering on my skin, a constant reminder of that night. Weeks passed, and I tried to convince myself it had all been some kind of hallucination. Maybe I'd fallen asleep at the wheel, had some vivid nightmare. But the nightmares that plagued me every night told a different story. In my dreams, I was back in that place of metal and strange lights. I saw beings moving around me, their features blurred and indistinct, but unmistakably not human. They performed tests, spoke in languages that hurt my ears to hear. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, the taste of metal in my mouth. During the day, I'd find myself zoning out, losing time. I'd blink and suddenly an hour had passed. My co-workers started to notice, asked if I was feeling all right. I brushed off their concerns, made excuses about not sleeping well. How could I explain what was really happening? I started avoiding mirrors, unable to look at my own reflection without seeing that haunted, changed version of myself. It was about a month after the incident when the physical symptoms started. At first it was just headaches, sharp and sudden, like ice picks being driven into my skull. Then came the nosebleeds, gushing and unpredictable. I'd be in the middle of a conversation and suddenly taste copper, feel warmth trickling down my face. The worst was the sensitivity to light. Sunlight became painful, forcing me to wear sunglasses even indoors. At night, streetlights pulsed and swam in my vision, making it almost impossible to drive. I went to doctors, underwent tests, but they found nothing wrong. Stress, they said. Maybe you should take some time off. But I knew it wasn't stress. It was something they had done to me, something that had changed me on a fundamental level. I started to wonder if I was radioactive, contaminated by whatever that silver dust had been. Was I putting others at risk just by being near them? The paranoia ate at me, isolating me further. Despite my fears, I couldn't stay away from that stretch of road. It called to me, a siren song I couldn't resist. I found myself driving out there at odd hours, parking where I thought my car had died that night. I'd sit for hours, watching the sky, half hoping and half dreading that the light would appear again. Sometimes I thought I saw something. Flash in the corner of my eye, a shadow moving against the stars. But it was always nothing, just tricks of light and my overwrought imagination. Or so I told myself. But every time I visited that spot, I'd feel sick to my stomach. It wasn't just nerves or fear. It was a physical reaction, like my body knew something my conscious mind didn't. My skin would prickle, the fine hairs on my arms standing on end. The air felt charged, like the moments before a lightning strike, and always, there was that faint buzzing in the back of my skull, so quiet I could almost convince myself I was imagining it. Almost. As the months wore on, I became obsessed with finding answers. I scoured the internet for similar stories, joined online forums dedicated to UFO sightings and alien abductions. At first I was skeptical of the wild claims I read, but the more I delved into it, the more I recognized elements of my own experience. The lost time, the inexplicable physical symptoms, the lingering sense of being forever changed. I started corresponding with other experiencers, as they called themselves. We shared our stories in hushed, coded language, always afraid of being overheard or discovered. Some of their accounts chilled me to the bone, eerily similar to my own. Others seemed far-fetched, even to me. But who was I to judge? My own story would have seemed insane to me just a few months earlier. I began to piece together a theory of what had happened to me based on these shared experiences and my fragmented memories. The beings, I couldn't bring myself to call them aliens, were studying us, experimenting. But to what end? It was during one of these late-night research sessions that I made a startling discovery. I'd been looking into historical accounts of strange lights in the sky over the Australian outback when I stumbled upon a news article from 1964. It detailed a mass sighting in a small town not far from where my encounter had occurred. Dozens of witnesses reported seeing a large, glowing object hovering over the desert. What caught my attention wasn't the sighting itself, but a detail mentioned almost as an afterthought. In the days following the incident, several residents complained of finding a fine, silvery dust coating their property. The article dismissed it as some kind of industrial pollutant, but I knew better. My hands shook as I read and reread the piece. This wasn't new. Whatever had happened to me had been happening for decades, maybe longer. The realization both terrified and oddly comforted me. I wasn't alone. I wasn't crazy. But it also meant that this was bigger than I could have imagined. How long had they been watching us? How many others had experiences like mine that went unreported, unbelieved? The discovery of the 1964 incident lit a fire under me. I took time off work, told my family I was going on a road trip to clear my head. In reality, I was retracing my steps from that fateful night, armed with cameras, EMF detectors, and other equipment I'd bought based on recommendations from the online UFO community. I camped out in the desert for days, scanning the skies, taking readings of the soil and air. Most nights passed uneventfully, just me alone with the vast, star-filled sky and the eerie silence of the outback. But on the third night, something happened. It started with that now familiar buzzing in my head, growing louder by the second. My equipment went haywire, needles swinging wildly, screens flickering with static. And then I saw it, the light. It was distant at first, a pinprick on the horizon, but it was moving, growing larger. My heart raced, a mix of terror and exhilaration flooding my veins. This was it. Proof. Validation. I raised my camera with trembling hands, desperate to capture what I was seeing. But as the light drew closer, a wave of dizziness washed over me. The world tilted and spun. I fought to stay conscious, to keep the camera steady. But it was a losing battle. The last thing I remember is a blinding flash, and then nothing. I woke up the next morning, sprawled on the desert floor. My equipment was scattered around me, sand-covered and useless. The camera's memory card was corrupted, hours of footage lost. I was right back where I started. No proof, no answers, just more questions and a gnawing sense of frustration. But something had changed. The constant buzz in my head, the one I'd grown accustomed to over the past months, was gone. In its place was a clarity I hadn't experienced since before that first encounter. As I packed up my gear, I noticed something etched into the sand near where I'd been lying. It looked like a series of symbols, unlike any language I'd ever seen. I quickly sketched them in my notebook before the wind could erase them. I didn't know what they meant, but I knew they were important. They had to be. That's when I realized this wasn't just happening to me, it wasn't random. They were trying to communicate. But why me? Why here in the middle of nowhere? I spent the drive home turning these questions over in my mind. The symbols from the sand burned into my memory. Back in civilization, I threw myself into researching the symbols. I consulted linguists, cryptographers, even archaeologists specializing in ancient writing systems. No one could make sense of them. Some suggested they might be a hoax, or that I had imagined them in my altered state. But I knew what I'd seen. I began seeing the symbols everywhere, in the patterns of tree branches, in the cracks on sidewalks, in the arrangement of stars on clear nights. It was like my brain had been rewired to recognize this new language, even if I couldn't understand it. I started having vivid dreams, more intense than the nightmares that had plagued me before. In these dreams, I was walking through vast, alien landscapes. Structures of impossible geometry loomed around me, and the sky was filled with colors I had no names for. I'd wake up with my head pounding, my nose bleeding, but also with a sense of exhilaration. Each dream felt like a step closer to understanding, to unraveling the mystery that had consumed my life. But understanding came at a cost. The more I delved into this other world, the more disconnected I felt from my own. Friends and family grew distant, concerned by my obsession but unable to reach me. I lost my job, spent my savings on more equipment, more research. I was spiraling and I knew it, but I couldn't stop. The truth felt so close, just out of reach. It all came to a head about a year after my initial encounter. I'd gone back to that same stretch of road as I often did, hoping for something. Anything. As I sat in my car, staring at the empty desert, a realization hit me. The answer wasn't out there in the vastness of space. It was inside me. Whatever had happened that night, whatever those beings had done, they'd changed me. The silver dust, the symbols, the dreams. It was all connected. I was the proof I'd been searching for all along. With shaking hands, I started the car and began to drive. I didn't have a destination in mind, just a feeling, an instinct pulling me forward. Hours passed, the landscape blurring around me. As the sun began to set, I found myself in a part of the outback I'd never seen before. The road ended abruptly at the base of a mesa, its red rock glowing in the dying light. Without hesitation, I got out of the car and started climbing. My body moved with a surety I didn't consciously possess, finding handholds and footholds in the darkness. When I reached the top, I gasped. Carved into the rock face was a massive version of one of the symbols from my dreams. It looked ancient, weathered by millennia of wind and sand, but unmistakable. As I stood there, awestruck, the air around me began to hum with energy. The symbol started to glow with a soft blue light. And then, in a moment of perfect clarity, I understood. This wasn't first contact. It was a reunion. I don't know how long I stood there, bathed in that ethereal light. Time seemed to stretch and bend, reality shifting around me. When it finally faded, I was changed. Not physically. The silver dust was still there, a part of me now, but internally. The fear, the confusion, the desperate need for answers, it all melted away. In its place was a profound sense of peace, of purpose. I made my way back down the mesa and drove home in a daze. I knew I could never fully explain what had happened. To me, what I now understood. Who would believe it? Even now, years later, as I write this account, I struggle to put it into words. The truth is both simpler and more complex than all the theories I'd concocted. We are not alone, have never been alone. But they are not out there, separate from us. They are a part of us, have always been a part of us. My experience in the outback wasn't an abduction or an experiment. It was an awakening, a reminder of a connection we've forgotten. I still drive out to that stretch of road sometimes, not out of fear or obsession, but out of gratitude. And each time, I feel that familiar tug, that buzzing energy. It's not scary anymore. It feels like coming home. I don't expect anyone to believe my story, and that's okay. I'm not looking for believers or followers. I'm sharing this in the hope that it might resonate with someone else out there, someone who's had their own unexplainable experience. To them, I say, you're not crazy. You're not alone. And the answers you're seeking, they're already inside you. You just have to be ready to understand them. Second story, Ice Station Abduction, Greenland, 2015. It was just another frigid day at the Arctic Research Station in Greenland. The year was 2015, and I'd been stationed there for about 6 months, studying climate patterns and ice core samples. The isolation was intense, but I'd grown used to it. Our team of 5 had settled into a routine, and the vast, icy landscape had become our entire world. That particular day started like any other. I woke up, put on my thermal layers, and headed to the main lab to check our instruments. As I walked across the compound, the crunch of snow under my boots was the only sound breaking the eerie silence of the Arctic. The sun was barely peeking over the horizon, casting long shadows across the endless white expanse. I remember thinking how small and insignificant we were out here, surrounded by nothing but ice and sky for hundreds of miles in every direction. Little did I know, that feeling of insignificance was about to be magnified beyond anything I could have imagined. As I entered the lab and began my usual checks, I noticed something odd. The readings on our atmospheric sensors were all over the place, fluctuating wildly in ways that made no sense. At first I thought it might be a malfunction. Equipment failures weren't uncommon in such extreme conditions. But as I double and triple checked the instruments, a knot of unease began to form in my stomach. Something wasn't right. I called over Dr. Larson, our lead researcher, to take a look. Her brow furrowed as she examined the readouts, muttering under her breath in Swedish. "This can't be right," she said, tapping at the screen. "These energy readings, I've never seen anything like this." Just then, Mika, our communications specialist, burst into the lab. Her face was pale, eyes wide with a mix of fear and excitement. "Guys, you need to see this. Now." We followed her outside, and that's when I saw it, hovering silently above the ice sheet, maybe half a mile from the station, was the largest aircraft I'd ever seen. But aircraft doesn't begin to describe it. It was a massive triangular shape, easily the size of several football fields, with no visible means of propulsion. The edges seemed to shimmer and blur, as if it wasn't fully solid. My mind reeled, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It couldn't be a plane or a blimp. Nothing man-made could be that big or move so silently. As we stood there, frozen in shock and awe, the craft began to emit a low, pulsing hum that I could feel in my bones. The air around us seemed to vibrate, and I felt the hairs on my arms stand up as if the atmosphere was suddenly charged with electricity. What happened next is both the most vivid and the haziest part of my memory. The humming intensified, building to a pitch that made my teeth ache. A brilliant white light erupted from the craft, so bright it was like staring into the sun. I remember raising my arm to shield my eyes, and then nothing. Just a complete blank. The next thing I knew, I was lying face down in the snow, my head pounding and my body aching as if I'd run a marathon. As I struggled to my feet, I saw the rest of my team scattered around me, all in various states of confusion. Dr. Larson was the first to speak, her voice shaky. What just happened?" I checked my watch and my blood ran cold. 3 hours had passed, but it felt like only seconds. The craft was gone, the sky was clear, and there was no sign of anything unusual, except for the fact that we were all disoriented and missing time. We stumbled back to the station, our minds racing with questions we were afraid to ask out loud. It wasn't until we checked the security cameras that the true strangeness of the situation became apparent. The footage showed us standing outside, looking up at something off camera. Then, in a flash of light that whited out the screen, we simply vanished. 3 hours of footage followed, showing nothing but empty, windswept snow. Then, another flash, and we reappeared in exactly the same spots, collapsing to the ground. I watched the video over and over, my hands shaking on the keyboard. What had happened to us during those missing hours? Where had we gone? The implications were terrifying, but there was no denying what the evidence suggested. We had experienced some kind of abduction. The days that followed were a blur of confusion, fear, and frantic attempts to understand what had happened to us. We were all experiencing similar physical symptoms, nausea, headaches, and a strange tingling sensation that seemed to course through our bodies. But it was the psychological impact that hit us hardest. We'd all wake up in cold sweats, plagued by nightmares we couldn't quite remember. I'd find myself staring out the window for hours, searching the sky for something I couldn't name. We tried to go about our work as usual, but there was an undercurrent of tension that never went away. Every unexplained noise, every flicker of the lights sent us into a panic. We were jumpy, irritable, and worst of all, we couldn't talk about it. Not really. How do you put into words an experience that defies all logic and reason? We'd start to discuss it, then trail off, unable to articulate the depth of our fear and confusion. It was like our minds were protecting us from something too terrible to comprehend. But our bodies remembered, even if our conscious minds didn't. I started noticing strange marks on my skin, perfectly circular bruises that appeared and disappeared without explanation. Mika complained of intense localized headaches, as if something was pressing against her skull from the inside. And Dr. Larson, she was the worst off. She'd zone out mid-conversation, her eyes going glassy and unfocused. Once I found her in the lab, frantically scribbling complex equations and diagrams on a whiteboard. When I asked her about it, she had no memory of doing it and couldn't explain what any of it meant. About a week after the incident, things took an even stranger turn. I was in my bunk, trying to fall asleep despite the constant anxiety that had become my new normal. Suddenly, I felt an overwhelming urge to go outside. It was like a compulsion, an itch in my brain that I couldn't ignore. I put on my cold weather gear in a daze and stepped out into the Arctic night. The aurora borealis was in full swing, ribbons of green and purple dancing across the sky. But as I watched, the lights began to move in ways I'd never seen before. They swirled and pulsed, forming intricate patterns that seemed to carry meaning, just beyond my comprehension. And then I heard it, the same low, thrumming hum from that day. It started soft, barely perceptible, but grew until it filled my head, drowning out all other thought. I stood there transfixed, as the sound seemed to rearrange something in my mind. Flashes of memory started to break through, sterile white rooms, long spindly fingers prodding at my skin, huge almond-shaped eyes staring into mine with an intelligence that was utterly alien. I fell to my knees in the snow, overwhelmed by the flood of images and sensations. Tears froze on my cheeks as I remembered the tests, the probes, the feeling of being studied like a lab specimen. But worse than the physical memories was the sense of their minds touching mine, sifting through my thoughts and memories with cold, clinical precision. I don't know how long I knelt there, lost in the horrors of recovered memory. When I finally came back to myself, the aurora had returned to normal and the hum was gone. I stumbled back inside, shaking not just from the cold, but from the realization that what had happened to us was far more terrifying than we had imagined. The next morning, I tried to tell the others about what I had experienced, but the words stuck in my throat. It was as if some part of me was still trying to protect my mind from the full impact of those memories. I could see in their eyes, though, that they understood. They'd had their own moments of clarity, their own glimpses into the abyss of what had been done to us. We gathered in the common room, a heavy silence hanging over us. Finally, Dr. Larson spoke. "We need to report this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The world needs to know." But even as she said it, I could see the doubt in her eyes. Who would believe us? We had the video footage, sure, but that only showed our disappearance, not what had happened after. And even if people did believe us, what then? Would we be quarantined, studied, treated like the aliens had treated us? The thought made me sick to my stomach. Mika shook her head vehemently. "No, we can't tell anyone. They'll think we're crazy. We'll lose everything, our careers, our credibility, maybe even our freedom." I understood her fear, the rational. Part of my brain knew how this would sound to the outside world. Mass hallucination, hysteria brought on by isolation, or worse, some kind of elaborate hoax. But I also knew with a bone-deep certainty that what had happened to us was real. The debate raged for hours, our voices rising and falling as we grappled with the impossible situation we found ourselves in. In the end, we came to an uneasy compromise. We would finish our assignment, compile all the data we could, and then decide as a group what to do with it. But as I looked at my teammates' haunted faces, I knew that no matter what we decided, our lives would never be the same. The Arctic silence that had once seemed peaceful now felt oppressive, hiding secrets too vast and terrible for human minds to comprehend. As the days wore on, the strain of our shared secret began to take its toll. We tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, going through the motions of our research, but our hearts weren't in it anymore. How could we focus on ice core samples and atmospheric data when we'd experienced something that shattered our understanding of the universe? The tension between us grew, each of us dealing with the trauma in our own way. I threw myself into work, spending long hours in the lab, analyzing and reanalyzing our readings from that day. There had to be some scientific explanation, some data that could prove what we'd experienced was real. But the more I dug, the more frustrated I became. The energy readings were off the charts, unlike anything in our records, but they proved nothing concrete. Late one night, as I was poring over the data for the 100th time, I noticed something strange. In the hours surrounding our disappearance, there were minute fluctuations in the gravitational readings. They were so small that I'd missed them before, but now that I saw them, a chill ran down my spine. Could this be evidence of some kind of localized gravitational distortion? My mind raced with the implications. If these beings had technology that could manipulate gravity itself, it would explain how they were able to move such a massive craft silently, and possibly even how they'd transported us. I wanted to share my discovery with the others, but when I went to find them, I realized how far we'd drifted apart. Dr. Larson had become increasingly erratic, spending hours staring at her equations and muttering to herself in a mix of Swedish and what sounded like gibberish. Mika had withdrawn almost completely, rarely leaving her room except for meals, and our two other teammates, Tom and Yuki, seemed to be in a constant state of paranoid alertness, jumping at every sound and watching the sky with a fervor that bordered on obsession. As I stood in the hallway, listening to the muffled sounds of my colleagues' distress, I felt utterly alone. We were all experiencing the same nightmare, but it was isolating us from each other in ways I couldn't have imagined. That night, unable to sleep, I bundled up and went outside again. The cold air bit at my face as I trudged through the snow, my breath forming clouds in front of me. I found myself drawn to the spot where we'd first seen the craft. The ice looked ordinary, pristine and unbroken, but I knew better. I knelt down, brushing away the top layer of snow, half expecting to find some kind of mark or evidence. Of course, there was nothing. But as I crouched there, my gloved hand on the ice, I felt a vibration. It was so faint that at first I thought I was imagining it. But no, there it was, a subtle tremor running through the ice, almost like a heartbeat. I pressed my ear to the ground, ignoring the biting cold, and listened. The vibration seemed to be coming from deep below the surface, a rhythmic pulsing that didn't match any natural phenomenon I knew of. My mind raced with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Were they still here, hidden beneath the ice? Had they left something behind? Or was this just the beginning of something even bigger? I don't know how long I stayed there, listening to that alien pulse, before the cold finally forced me back, inside. As I stumbled into the warmth of the station, I was met by Tom's wild-eyed stare. "You felt it too, didn't you?" he asked, his voice hoarse. I nodded, unable to speak. Tom grabbed my arm, his grip painfully tight. "They're coming back," he whispered. "I can feel it. They're not done with us." I wanted to dismiss his words as paranoia, but deep down I feared he was right. The next few days were a blur of increasing tension and fear. We'd all felt the vibrations now, each of us drawn to that spot on the ice at different times. It was as if something was calling to us, tugging at the edges of our minds. Our work had all but stopped. We went through the motions of data collection and analysis, but our hearts weren't in it. Every spare moment was spent watching the sky or pressing our ears to the ice, waiting for something. We barely spoke to each other anymore, each lost in our own personal hell of anticipation and dread. The isolation that had once been merely challenging now felt suffocating. We were trapped here, miles from any help, with something unimaginable possibly lurking beneath our feet. And worst of all, part of me was almost looking forward to it. The human mind isn't built to handle this kind of uncertainty, this constant state of fear and anticipation. I found myself wishing they would just come back, do whatever they were going to do, if only to end this torturous waiting. It was on the 10th day after our initial encounter that everything changed again. I was in the communications room, half-heartedly, checking our satellite link when all of our equipment suddenly went haywire. Screens flickered with static, dials spun wildly, and a high-pitched whine filled the air. I yelled for the others, and we all converged in the room, watching in horror as our connection to the outside world disintegrated before our eyes. And then we felt it. The whole station began to vibrate, softly at first, then with increasing intensity. It was the same thrumming we'd felt before, but amplified 100-fold. The floor beneath our feet seemed to ripple, and I had the sickening sensation that the entire research station was being lifted off its foundations. Mika let out a strangled cry and pointed out the window. Through the glass, we could see impossible. The ground around the station was dissolving. There's no other word for it. The ice and snow were breaking apart into tiny particles, swirling upwards in a vortex of white. And beyond that, emerging from the maelstrom, was the craft. It rose from beneath the ice like some gargantuan sea creature breaching the surface, its metallic skin gleaming under the harsh Arctic sun. It was even larger than I remembered, its presence so overwhelming that it seemed to warp the very air around it. We stood there, frozen in terror and awe, as the craft continued to rise, bringing with it chunks of ice and earth. The station groaned and creaked around us, and for a moment I was certain we were going to be torn apart. What happened next is difficult to describe, because it felt like reality itself was bending. The walls of the station seemed to become transparent, fading away like mist, and suddenly we were exposed to the open air. But it wasn't cold. Instead, we were enveloped in a field of energy that tingled against my skin. I could see my teammates floating beside me, their faces masks of terror and confusion. We were being drawn towards the craft, pulled by some invisible force that we couldn't resist. As we got closer, I could make out more details of its surface. It wasn't smooth as I'd first thought, but covered in intricate patterns that seemed to shift and change as I looked at them. They weren't just designs, I realized with a jolt. They were moving, pulsing with light and energy, almost like circuitry, but on a scale and complexity that made our most advanced technology look like children's toys. I felt my mind struggling to comprehend what I was seeing, my perception shifting in ways that were almost painful. And then, as we drew even closer, a section of the craft's surface simply opened. There was no seam, no door that I could see. One moment it was solid, the next there was an opening large enough to swallow us all. The darkness beyond was absolute, a void that seemed to pull at not just our bodies but our very consciousness. I wanted to scream, to fight against the inexorable pull, but my body wouldn't respond. It was as if I was paralyzed, reduced to nothing more than an observer in my own body. I could see the same helpless terror reflected in my teammates' eyes as we were drawn into that impossible darkness. The moment we crossed the threshold, everything changed. The darkness gave way to light, but not like any light I'd ever seen before. It was as if we were suddenly immersed in a sea of luminescent fog, colors shifting and swirling around us in patterns that hurt my eyes to look at directly. I felt weightless, disconnected from my body, yet more aware of every nerve and sinew than I'd ever been. And then, the presences made themselves known. I couldn't see them, not in any way that I could describe with words, but I could feel them, vast, ancient intelligences that regarded us with a mixture of curiosity and something else. Not quite emotion as we understand it, but a form of intent that was alien and terrifying in its intensity. They didn't communicate in words or images, but in bursts of pure concept that bloomed in my mind like psychedelic flowers. I understood in that moment that what was happening to us was both an investigation and a test. These beings, and I use that term loosely, for they were as far beyond us as we are beyond amoebae, were studying us, yes, but they were also pushing us, probing the limits of our consciousness, our ability to perceive and understand. I felt my mind expanding, forced to encompass concepts and dimensions that it was never designed to handle. It was exhilarating and agonizing in equal measure, like trying to pour an ocean into a thimble. I was aware of my teammates experiencing similar things, could almost feel the tenor of their thoughts as we were all connected in this bizarre psychic symphony. And through it all, there was a sense of urgency, of some greater purpose behind these entities' actions. They were preparing us for something, changing us in ways I couldn't begin to fathom. Time lost all meaning in that strange, shimmering realm. It could have been minutes or millennia that we floated there, our minds being reshaped by forces beyond our comprehension. Flashes of insight came to me, glimpses of truths so profound they threatened to shatter my sanity. I saw the vastness of the universe laid out before me, countless worlds teeming with life in forms I could barely comprehend. I understood in that moment that what we thought of as reality was just the thinnest surface layer of something infinitely more complex and beautiful. But with that understanding came a terrible knowledge of our own insignificance in the grand scheme of things, and of the sheer, mind-bending alienness of the entities that had brought us here. They were so far beyond us that even their most benign actions could destroy us utterly, like a human accidentally stepping on an ant. And yet, there was a purpose to what they were doing to us. I could sense it, even if I couldn't fully grasp it. We were being changed, prepared for something. A task? A transformation? I couldn't tell. The concepts were too big, too strange for my human mind to hold on to. Every time I thought I was close to understanding, it would slip away like smoke through my fingers. Through it all, I was acutely aware of my own body, even as I felt disconnected from it. I could sense changes happening at a cellular level, my very DNA being rewritten by energies I couldn't begin to comprehend. It wasn't painful exactly, but it was deeply unsettling, like feeling every cell in your body vibrating at once. Just when I thought I couldn't take any more, that my mind would simply snap under the strain of all this impossible knowledge, everything shifted again. The swirling colors coalesced, forming into shapes and patterns that slowly resolved into a room, but not like any room I'd ever seen before. The walls, if you could call them that, seemed to be made of living light, pulsing and shifting in hypnotic patterns. There was no clear distinction between floor and ceiling. Space itself seemed to bend and curve in ways that made my eyes hurt to look at. And there, in the center of it all, were the beings. I say beings, but that word fails to capture what I saw. They were tall, impossibly tall, with bodies that seemed to be made of pure energy barely contained in a vaguely humanoid form. Their faces, if you could call them that, were dominated by enormous, almond-shaped eyes that swirled with galaxies. Looking into those eyes was like staring into the heart of the universe itself. I was dimly aware of my teammates around me, all of us suspended in some kind of energy field. We were naked, I realized with a distant sort of embarrassment, but it hardly seemed to matter in the face of what we were experiencing. One of the beings approached me, moving with a fluid grace that defied physics. As it drew closer, I felt my mind expanding again, stretching to encompass whatever communication was about to take place. The being raised what I can only describe as a hand, though it was more like a tendril of pure light. It touched my forehead, and in that instant, I understood. Not everything. I don't think a human mind could ever fully comprehend their motivations or nature, but enough to grasp the magnitude of what was happening to us. We were being altered, upgraded in a sense, to serve as intermediaries, bridges between our world and theirs. The task ahead of us was monumental, terrifying, and yet, somehow, exhilarating. The knowledge poured into me was overwhelming. I saw flashes of future events, of changes coming to our world that would shake the very foundations of human civilization. Climate shifts, geological upheavals, societal transformations, all part of a grand plan that spanned millennia. And we, the 5 of us, were to play a crucial role in preparing humanity for what was to come. But even as I grasped the importance of our mission, I felt a deep sense of violation. We hadn't been given a choice in this. We were being remade, our very essence altered, to serve a purpose we hadn't agreed to. I wanted to protest, to assert my free will. But in the presence of these beings, such concepts seemed laughably primitive. They operated on a level where individual choice was as meaningless as a single atom's choice in the workings of a star. And yet, paradoxically, I understood that our individuality, our human perspective, was exactly why we had been chosen. We were to be the translators, the interpreters of the incomprehensible. As the being's touch lingered on my forehead, I felt the last vestiges of my old self slipping away. Memories, personality, the very core of who I was, all were being sifted through. Some discarded, others altered, new elements added. I was being unmade and remade, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. In my peripheral vision, I could see my teammates undergoing similar transformations. Mika was weeping silently, tears of light streaming down her face. Dr. Larson seemed to be in a state of ecstasy, her body arched as if in rapture. Tom and Yuki were perfectly still, their eyes wide and unseeing as the changes racked their bodies and minds. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The being withdrew its touch, and I felt myself falling, tumbling through layers of reality I didn't know existed. I came to on the frozen ground outside our research station, gasping and shaking. The others were there too, all of us huddled together in the snow, naked and trembling. The craft was gone, the ice undisturbed, as if nothing had ever happened. But we were changed. I could feel it in every cell of my body, in the very way I perceived the world around me. Colors seemed more vivid, sounds more clear, and in my mind, a vast repository of knowledge hummed, waiting to be accessed. We stumbled back to the station in silence, each lost in our own thoughts, grappling with the enormity of what had happened to us. As we dressed and gathered in the common room, I looked at my teammates, my fellow chosen ones, and saw the same mix of awe, fear, and determination in their eyes that I felt in my heart. We had been given a task, a purpose beyond anything we could have imagined. But we had also been irrevocably altered, turned into something not quite human. As we sat there trying to come to terms with our new reality, I couldn't help but wonder, had we been elevated or merely used? Were we saviors, or just tools in the hands of beings so vast and incomprehensible that we couldn't even begin to guess at their true motives? I didn't have answers to these questions. I'm not sure I ever will. All I know is that our lives, and potentially the fate of all humanity, had been set on a new course that night in the Arctic. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together, carrying the weight of impossible knowledge and the touch of the cosmos within us. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I still hear that low, thrumming hum, calling to something deep inside me that is no longer entirely human. Third story, alien encounter in Scotland, 1982. It was supposed to be just another hiking trip in the Scottish Highlands. I'd done it dozens of times before, always alone, always reveling in the solitude and the rugged beauty of the landscape. But this time was different. It was late August 1982, and I'd set out early in the morning, my backpack loaded with supplies for a 3-day trek through some of the most remote parts of the Highlands. The weather was perfect, crisp, clear, with just a hint of autumn in the air. I remember feeling so alive, so connected to the world around me as I made my way up the winding trails, the heather-covered hills stretching out as far as the eye could see. I had no idea that in just a few hours my entire world would be turned upside down, and I'd be left questioning everything I thought I knew about reality. I'd been hiking for about 4 hours when I decided to stop for lunch. I found a nice spot overlooking a deep valley, the mountains rising up on either side like ancient guardians. As I sat there munching on my sandwich and sipping from my canteen, I noticed a change in the air. It was subtle at first, just a slight drop in temperature, a faint dampness that hadn't been there before. I didn't think much of it at the time. Weather can change quickly in the Highlands, after all. But as I packed up my things and continued on my way, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The birds had gone quiet, and there was a heaviness to the air that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. That's when I saw the fog. It came rolling in from the east, thick and white, moving faster than any fog I'd ever seen before. Within minutes it had swallowed up the valley below and was creeping up the hillside towards me. I quickened my pace, hoping to find some higher ground or a sheltered spot where I could wait it out, but it was no use. The fog enveloped me completely, so dense that I could barely see my hand in front of my face. I fumbled for my compass, but in my panic, I dropped it. I heard it clatter against the rock somewhere at my feet, but I couldn't see where it had fallen. That's when the real fear set in. I was alone in one of the most remote parts of Scotland, with no visibility and no way to orient myself. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself down. I just needed to stay put, I told myself. The fog would lift eventually, and then I could get my bearings. But the fog didn't lift. If anything, it seemed to get thicker, pressing in on me from all sides. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, my heart pounding in my chest. It could have been minutes, or it could have been hours. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that blank, white world. And then, through the stillness, I heard something. It was faint at first, barely perceptible, a low, pulsing hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I held my breath, straining my ears. Was I imagining it? But no, it was definitely there, growing louder by the second. And then, cutting through the fog like a knife, I saw them. 3 figures, standing maybe 20 feet ahead of me. At first, I thought they must be other hikers, and I felt a surge of relief. But as I squinted through the mist, trying to make out their features, that relief turned to ice-cold terror. These weren't human. They were tall, much taller than any person I'd ever seen, with bodies that seemed too thin, too angular to be natural. But it was their faces that made my blood run cold. They were elongated, almost skull-like, with enormous almond-shaped eyes that glowed with an eerie bluish light. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything, but I was paralyzed with fear. I could only stand there, trembling, as those glowing eyes fixed on me with an intelligence that was unmistakably alien. The humming grew louder, filling my head until I thought my skull would split open. The figures began to move towards me, their movements fluid and unnatural. I tried to back away, but my legs wouldn't respond. It was like I was trapped in a nightmare, unable to escape as the things from my deepest fears approached. Just as the nearest figure reached out a long, spindly arm towards me, everything went dark. Not the darkness of night, or even the darkness of closing your eyes. This was a complete absence of light, of sound, of sensation. It was as if I had been erased from existence. I don't know how long I was in that void. It could have been seconds, or it could have been years. When I came back to myself, I was lying face down on the ground, the taste of dirt and grass in my mouth. For a moment I just lay there, too afraid to move, too afraid to open my eyes. But slowly, reality began to seep back in. I could feel the warmth of sunlight on my skin, hear the faint rustle of wind through the heather. Cautiously, I opened my eyes and lifted my head. I was back at my campsite. The same campsite I had left that morning, miles away from where I had encountered whatever those things were. I sat up slowly, my head spinning. How was this possible? I looked around, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My tent was still there, exactly as I had left it. My backpack was propped up against a rock, looking untouched. But something was wrong. The quality of the light was different, softer, more golden. With a jolt of panic, I realized it was late afternoon. But that couldn't be right. I had set out early in the morning, and I couldn't have been unconscious for that long. Could I? Shakily, I got to my feet and stumbled over to my backpack. I needed to check my map to try and figure out what had happened. But as I pulled it out, I froze. The map was covered in strange circular burn marks. They formed a pattern across the paper, like some kind of alien constellation. My hands shaking, I reached for my compass. The needle was spinning wildly, as if it couldn't decide which way was north. I dropped it like it was on fire, watching as it continued its frenzied dance on the ground. What had happened to me? How had I gotten back here, and what were those beings I had seen in the fog? I spent the next few hours in a state of near panic, pacing around my campsite, trying to make sense of what had happened. My mind kept replaying those terrifying moments in the fog, the sight of those inhuman figures with their glowing eyes. But every time I tried to focus on the details, they seemed to slip away, like trying to hold onto a dream after waking. I checked my watch, hoping it might give me some clue as to how much time had passed. But the face was blank, the hands frozen at 11:37. Was that when it happened? When I encountered those things? As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the campsite, I realized I had a decision to make. I could pack up and try to hike out in the dark, risking getting lost or worse. Or I could stay put until morning, alone with my thoughts and the terrifying possibility that whatever had taken me might come back. In the end, exhaustion and fear won out. I couldn't face the idea of stumbling through the darkness, jumping at every shadow. So I crawled into my tent, zipping it up tight, as if that flimsy layer of nylon could protect me from whatever was out there. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing orbs staring back at me. The silence of the night was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of wind through the grass or the distant cry of an animal. But was it really an animal? Or was it something else? Something that didn't belong in this world? I lay there, my entire body tense, straining my ears for any sound that might indicate I wasn't alone. At some point I must have dozed off, because suddenly I was jerking awake, my heart pounding. For a moment I couldn't remember where I was or what had happened. Then it all came flooding back, and I had to clamp a hand over my mouth to stifle a scream. The first light of dawn was a relief I never thought I'd feel so intensely. As soon as it was bright enough to see, I packed up my camp with shaking hands, constantly glancing over my shoulder. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that at any moment those figures might emerge from the morning mist. My gear felt wrong somehow, subtly altered in ways I couldn't quite put my finger on. My clothes smelled different, a faint metallic odor that made my stomach churn. And my skin, I noticed strange geometric patterns on my arms and legs, like faint sunburns in impossible shapes. They didn't hurt, but they shouldn't have been there. I set off down the trail at a near run, desperate to get back to civilization, to other people. But as I hiked, I realized something else was wrong. The landscape didn't match my memories. Hills were in the wrong places, streams running where I was sure there had been dry ground before. It was as if the very land itself had been subtly rearranged while I was gone. I tried to use my map, but the burn marks made it nearly useless, and my broken compass was no help at all. I was lost in a place I thought I knew like the back of my hand. Hours passed, and my panic grew. I should have reached the trailhead by now, should have seen some sign of human presence. But there was nothing but endless, unfamiliar wilderness. The sun climbed higher in the sky, beating down on me mercilessly. I was running low on water, and the thought of having to spend another night out here, alone and exposed, was almost more than I could bear. That's when I heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold. The same low, pulsing hum I had heard in the fog. It was distant, but growing louder with each passing second. I spun around, my eyes darting frantically across the landscape, searching for any sign of those terrifying figures. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the humming stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I stood there, frozen in place, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Minutes ticked by and nothing happened. No alien figures appeared, no strange lights in the sky. Just the wind through the heather and the distant call of a bird. Slowly, my racing heart began to calm. Had I imagined it? Was my mind playing tricks on me after the trauma of yesterday? I wasn't sure, and that uncertainty was almost worse than seeing those beings again. I forced myself to keep moving, though every step felt like I was walking through molasses. The sun was starting to dip towards the horizon, and I knew I needed to find shelter soon. That's when I spotted something in the distance, a glint of metal that didn't belong in this wild landscape. Hope surged through me, and I quickened my pace. As I got closer, I realized it was a car. An old, rusted-out Land Rover that looked like it had been sitting there for years, but it was unmistakably human, and at that moment, it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. I approached the vehicle cautiously, half expecting it to disappear like some cruel mirage. But it was real, solid under my trembling hands as I yanked open the driver's side door. The interior was musty and filled with dead leaves, but I didn't care. I crawled inside, slamming the door behind me and locking it for good measure. For the first time since I'd woken up at my campsite, I felt a small measure of safety. I curled up in the seat, my backpack clutched to my chest like a shield. As the last light faded from the sky, I allowed myself to hope that maybe, just maybe, I would make it through this nightmare. I must have fallen asleep at some point because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by a sharp tapping sound. For a moment, I was disoriented, forgetting where I was. Then it all came rushing back. The fog, the alien figures, the strange journey through an altered landscape. The tapping continued, and I realized with a start that it was coming from the window of the Land Rover. My heart leapt into my throat as I slowly turned my head, terrified of what I might see. To my immense relief, it wasn't one of those otherworldly beings, but a human face peering in at me. An old man with a weathered face and kind eyes, concern etched into every line. I fumbled with the door handle, my fingers clumsy with fear and exhaustion. As I stumbled out of the vehicle, the old man steadied me with a firm grip on my arm. "Easy there, lad," he said in a thick Scottish brogue. "You look like you've seen a ghost." If only he knew how close to the truth that was. The man introduced himself as Angus, a local shepherd who had been out looking for some wayward sheep when he'd spotted the abandoned Land Rover. As I tried to explain what had happened to me, my words came out in a jumbled rush. I must have sounded completely insane, talking about fog and alien abductions and lost time. But Angus just listened patiently, nodding occasionally, his expression unreadable. When I finally ran out of words, he was quiet for a long moment, studying me with those piercing blue eyes. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. "You're not the first to have such an experience in these hills, lad. There are old stories, tales passed down through generations of strange lights in the sky and people gone missing only to return changed." Angus led me back to his small cottage, a cozy stone building nestled in a sheltered valley. As we walked, he told me more about the local legends, stories of the others who supposedly lived in the hidden places of the highlands. Most people dismissed them as fairy tales or the ramblings of isolated mountain folk. But Angus spoke of them with a gravity that sent shivers down my spine. He talked about time slips, about people who went missing for days or weeks, only to return with no memory of where they'd been, about strange marks on the land, crop circles in places where no human could have reached. Inside the cottage, Angus's wife, Moira, fussed over me, insisting I eat something and wrapping me in a warm blanket. The normality of it all, the crackling fire, the smell of home-cooked food, was almost overwhelming after the surreal horror of the past day and night. As I sipped a steaming mug of tea, Angus disappeared into another room, returning with an old leather-bound book. He placed it on the table in front of me, opening it to reveal pages filled with handwritten accounts and crude sketches. "This book has been in my family for generations," Angus explained. "It's a record of all the strange happenings in these parts. Look here." He pointed to a sketch that made my heart stop. It showed 3 tall, thin figures with elongated heads and large, almond-shaped eyes. They were unmistakably the same beings I had seen in the fog. The account next to it, dated 1923, described an encounter chillingly similar to my own. I read page after page, my hands shaking, as I realized that what had happened to me was part of something much larger, much older than I could have imagined. As the night wore on, Angus and Moira shared more stories, both from the book and from their own experiences. They spoke of lights in the sky that moved in impossible ways, of animals found mutilated with surgical precision, of hikers and shepherds who returned from the hills changed in subtle but undeniable ways. With each tale, the reality of what I had experienced settled deeper into my bones. This wasn't some isolated incident or hallucination. Whatever had taken me, whatever those beings were, they had been here in the highlands for a very long time. Moira examined the strange geometric patterns on my skin, her face grave. "I've seen these before," she said softly. "On others who've had experiences. They'll fade in time, but they never quite go away." She mixed up a salve of herbs and spread it gently over the marks. The coolness was soothing, but it did little to ease the deep, existential dread that had taken root in my chest. As dawn broke, painting the hills outside in soft pinks and golds, Angus helped me plan my route back to civilization. He marked safe paths on a new map, avoiding areas where there had been frequent sightings. Before I left, he pressed something into my hand, a small flat stone etched with strange symbols. "It's a protection charm," he explained. "Been in the family for generations. It might not stop them from taking Ye again, but it might help you find your way back if they do." I clutched the stone tightly, grateful for any small measure of comfort, any connection to the normal world I had known just days ago. The journey back to my car was a blur of paranoia and hypervigilance. Every rustle in the undergrowth, every shadow cast by a cloud passing over the sun, sent my heart racing. I kept Angus's charm clutched tightly in my hand, my thumb tracing the unfamiliar symbols over and over. Whether it truly offered any protection or not, it was a tangible reminder that I wasn't alone, that someone else understood what I had been through. When I finally reached my car, parked at the trailhead where I had left it what felt like a lifetime ago, I broke down. I sat there in the driver's seat, sobbing uncontrollably, the full weight of my experience crashing down on me. How could I go back to my normal life after this? How could I explain to anyone what had happened to me? The world I had known, the reality I had taken for granted, had been shattered irreparably. As I drove home, my mind raced with questions. What were those beings? Where had they taken me? What had they done to me during those lost hours? The geometric patterns on my skin had faded to barely visible marks, but I could still feel them, a constant reminder of my encounter. I found myself checking my rearview mirror obsessively, half expecting to see those tall, alien figures standing in the middle of the road behind me. The following weeks were a struggle to readjust to normal life. I went through the motions of my daily routine, but everything felt off, somehow less real than before. Colors seemed muted, sounds distorted. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was now seeing the world through a veil, aware of a hidden layer of reality that most people never glimpsed. Sleep became my enemy. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in that fog, facing those glowing eyes. I would wake up gasping, my sheets soaked with sweat, the faint hum of that alien presence echoing in my ears. I tried to research what had happened to me, spending hours in libraries and poring over every book on UFOs and alien encounters I could find. Most of it seemed ridiculous, the stuff of tabloids and conspiracy theorists. But every now and then, I'd come across an account that resonated with my experience, sending chills down my spine. I became obsessed with the idea of finding others who had gone through similar ordeals. I joined online forums, attended UFO conventions, anything to connect with people who might understand. But the more I delved into this world, the more isolated I felt. Even among believers, my experience seemed extreme, too vivid, too real. And the skeptics, their dismissals and explanations felt hollow, unable to account for the sheer visceral terror of what I had experienced. How could sleep paralysis or hallucinations explain the burns on my map, the broken compass, the lost time? How could they account for the stories Angus had shared, the generations of encounters recorded in that old leather book? As months passed, I found myself drawn back to the highlands. Not to hike. I don't think I'll ever be able to enjoy solitary treks through the wilderness again. But I needed answers, needed to understand what had happened to me. I rented a small cottage not far from where Angus and Moira lived, spending my days exploring the area and nights poring over local historical records and folklore. I learned that the region had a long history of strange occurrences. There were Neolithic stone circles with unexplained astronomical alignments, medieval accounts of fairy abductions that sounded eerily similar to modern UFO encounters, and countless stories of lights in the sky and missing time passed down through generations. The more I uncovered, the more I began to suspect that whatever had taken me wasn't just passing through. They, whatever they were, had been here for a very long time, perhaps longer than humans had inhabited these lands. One night, about 6 months after my encounter, I was driving back to my cottage after a day spent interviewing locals about their experiences. The sun had set, and a thick mist was rolling in from the hills. As I rounded a bend in the road, my headlights illuminated something that made my blood run cold. There, standing at the edge of the road, were 3 tall, impossibly thin figures. For a split second, their eyes reflected the light, glowing with that eerie blue luminescence I remembered all too well. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop on the wet road. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I blinked, and in that instant, they were gone. Had they ever been there at all? Or was my mind playing cruel tricks on me, conjuring up the very thing I feared most? I sat there, engine idling, for what felt like hours, too terrified to move forward, too stubborn to turn back. Finally, gathering every ounce of courage I possessed, I inched the car forward. As I passed the spot where I thought I'd seen them, I felt a familiar buzzing sensation in my head, a subtle pressure behind my eyes. The car's electrical system flickered, the radio switching on and emitting a burst of static before going silent again. And then, nothing. Just the empty road. Ahead, the mist swirling in my headlights. When I got back to my cottage, I was a wreck. I double-checked every lock, drew all the curtains, and huddled in my bed with the lights on, Angus's charm clutched tightly in my fist. Sleep was out of the question. Instead, I found myself reliving every moment of my original encounter, searching for some detail I might have missed, some clue that could help me make sense of what was happening. It was during those long, sleepless hours that a chilling realization began to take shape in my mind. What if my encounter in the highlands hadn't been a random event? What if, somehow, I had been chosen? The thought was terrifying, but it would explain why I felt so drawn to this place, why I couldn't let go of what had happened to me. Were they watching me even now, these strange beings from beyond our understanding? And if so, what did they want from me? As dawn broke, casting a pale light through the gaps in my curtains, I made a decision. I couldn't live like this anymore, jumping at shadows and questioning my own sanity. I needed to confront this head-on, to find some way to communicate with these beings, to understand their purpose. It was a crazy idea, born of sleep deprivation and desperation, but it felt like the only way forward. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into research, not just about UFO encounters, but about communication theory, xenobiology, even quantum physics. I was grasping at straws, I knew, but I had to try something. I began spending nights out, on the hills, armed with cameras, sensors, and recording equipment. Most nights nothing happened, but occasionally I'd catch glimpses of strange lights in the sky or experience unexplained equipment malfunctions. Once I woke up to find my camera had captured a series of images showing bizarre, elongated shadows moving across an empty field. It was on one of these nights, about 2 months into my vigils, that it happened again. The fog rolled in, thicker and faster than any natural mist. The air hummed with that now familiar energy, making my skin prickle and my head spin. And then, emerging from the whiteness, I saw them. The same tall, otherworldly figures that had haunted my nightmares for months. This time, I forced myself to stand my ground. My whole body was shaking, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I stayed put. I held up my hands in what I hoped was a universal gesture of peace, and spoke. I'm not sure what I said. My mind was a blank of terror and adrenaline, but I remember trying to convey that I meant no harm, that I only wanted to understand. For a long moment nothing happened. They stood there unnaturally still, those glowing eyes fixed on me with an intensity that seemed to pierce right through to my soul. And then, slowly, one of them raised a hand. A long, multi-jointed finger pointed at me, then at its own chest, then swept in a wide arc to encompass the hills around us. The gesture was unmistakable. You. Us. Here. Before I could react, that familiar darkness engulfed me. But this time, it wasn't a void. I was aware on some level of movement, of a sensation of vast distances being traversed in the blink of an eye. Images and sensations flooded my mind, stars seen from impossible angles, landscapes that couldn't exist on Earth, beings and civilizations beyond my comprehension. It was overwhelming, beautiful, and utterly terrifying. When I came back to myself, I was lying on the ground where I'd been standing. My equipment was fried, the cameras and sensors reduced to useless hunks of melted plastic and metal. The sun was rising, painting the sky in soft pinks and golds. It looked exactly the same as it had when I'd arrived the night before, but I knew with absolute certainty that many hours had passed, possibly even days. In the months since that night, I've struggled to make sense of what happened to me. The UIT images and sensations I experienced during that journey, communication, whatever it was, they're burned into my mind, but they're like trying to remember a dream. Every time I think I've grasped some crucial detail, it slips away, leaving me with only vague impressions and a deep, unsettling sense of the vastness of the universe. I've tried to write it all down, to capture every fragment of memory before it fades. I've filled notebooks with sketches and descriptions, trying to piece together some coherent narrative from the jumble of alien concepts and impossible geometries that now occupy a corner of my mind. But the more I try to understand, the more I realize how little I actually know. What I do know is this: we are not alone in the universe, and the beings I encountered, whether they're aliens in the traditional sense, interdimensional travelers, or something even stranger, have been with us for a very long time. The Highlands, with their ancient stone circles and generations of folklore, are just one of many places where the veil between our world and theirs is thin. I don't know why they chose me, or what their ultimate purpose is. Are they studying us, preparing us for some future contact? Or are their motives so alien that we can't hope to comprehend them with our limited human perspective? I may never have the answers, but I do know that I can never go back to the person I was before that foggy day in the Highlands. My world has been irrevocably expanded, my understanding of reality fundamentally altered. Sometimes, on clear nights, I find myself staring up at the stars, feeling both infinitesimally small and strangely connected to something vast and unknowable. And sometimes, just at the edge of hearing, I catch that faint, familiar hum, a reminder that they're still out there, watching, waiting, and that my journey, whatever it may be, is far from over.